Hello, and welcome to another webinar by the Rayonex Foundation. Today, we will focus on the topic of RAI, that is the Rayonex Artificial Intelligence, or the Intelligent RAH interpretation software, which will greatly facilitate the work of therapists, especially those using a Rayocomp PS 1000 Polar 4.0. Let's get straight to the questions that led us to RAI, that is, the Rayonex Artificial Intelligence. Whenever users of a Rayocomp PS 1000 Polar 4.0 perform a checkup or detailed test with their Rayoscan, they tend to ask the following question. After seeing the results on the screen, how can I optimally pass these results on to a patient so that they understand them and then naturally start the corresponding therapy? In other words, harmonization with the polar, either in practice or at home. That was one of the fundamental questions about RAI. But another question was also how we can further support therapists with RAI. Often it is the case that the cause-oriented treatment approach of bioresonance, according to Paul Schmidt, that means the integration of causal influences such as electrosmog, geopathy, or for example the supplementation of certain products, whether it is about detoxification, whether it is about specific supplementation of minerals or vitamins or other topics, is simply neglected because the therapist has an internal block in presenting this to the patient as necessary. Specifically, the therapist does not want to appear as a salesperson towards the patient. And creating a document here as well that logically demonstrates the necessity of this cause-oriented treatment approach is, of course, incredibly valuable and immensely supports the user in their work. Let's briefly go over the product range again for which RAI was created. The entire product portfolio of Rayonex Biomedical GmbH includes the Rayometer Plus as a very simple entry-level device where you can manually set individual frequency base values, then via the Rayocomp PS 10 Plus, which is used both in the human and veterinary fields as a mobile, but also already an automatically operating therapy device can be used here. And then, of course, our flagship, which is the PS 1000 Polar 4.0, which offers not only a fully automatic analysis, but also, of course, a fully automatic harmonization. And precisely for this device is RAI intended, and that's because we need the determination of the corresponding necessary RAH programs for RAI, which should then also be evaluated and also still depend on certain percentages. We simply can't achieve that with a Rayocomp PS 10 Plus or a Rayometer Plus. Therefore, RAI is intended for use with a Rayocomp PS 1000 Polar 4.0. Yes, and if we take a look at the current status quo, it seems that we have the PS 1000 Polar 4.0 on one side, as you can see in the picture on the left, in a practice standing there. There, the most important RAH programs will then be examined using ECG-based diagnostics, either in a checkup, that is in the most important 21 areas of the body, to first get a rough direction. And then in a detailed test in this area, really researched, in depth analyzed, so to speak, and from this a checkup result or a result of the detailed test emerges, which you can see here on the screen. Yes, And that is the starting point with which a therapist usually explains to the patient what is really happening in their body and how everything is connected. Now, admittedly, this is already a tricky matter because if I, for example, take a look at the checkup here and I see the result is cell and tissue, the result is lymphatic system, and the result is, as a third example, the area of the heart. So, and just aligning these three topics here and how they relate to each other is already, first of all, a challenge for every therapist, especially for the new therapists joining who are just starting with the system. Yes, and offering a solution for this is what RAI is there for. And exactly the same applies to the detailed test. This means here we have even listed 40 of the most important RAH programs, and here too it is of course about how can this be brought together in an overall context. Yes, and once you have carried out this ECG-based energetic analysis, the checkup leads into the detailed test, produces the results. Then, based on that, the individualized treatment programs are accordingly derived and thus either stationary with the Polar itself in practice or with the PS10 or just in home therapy with a Rayocomp PS10 basic then treated. The programs that have been found are then saved on the green card and you can then easily use it for home therapy. But let's now get to the basic use of this app. So RAI is actually a really smart app. That means RAI is a smartphone app that generates a very comprehensive interpretation report from the data of a checkup test or a detailed test and then sends it to you directly via email. And RAI is particularly strong at the point where it deals with linguistic or possible or eventual linguistic hurdles. This means RAI was initially designed as an international interpretation software, and therefore we can directly reflect the most important world languages with RAI. I will come back to what this means in a moment. Yes, and you can see here on this smartphone at the top the icon of RAI. You tap on that and then you're immediately greeted with welcome to RAI. And then in the very first step, I set the language and the country I'm in so that starting with this app is successful. Yes, and a particularly important point that we naturally want to emphasize again here is the safety of RAI, because under no circumstances do we want any personal data of the patient to end up somewhere on the internet and potentially be misused here. And how can you make such an app completely secure? Simply by not entering any personal data into the internet, and that's exactly how RAI operates. The only thing I enter at the beginning is the email address to which I want the report to be sent. So that means the email address of the therapist to whom RAI should send the interpretation reports. That's the only information I give to RAI. There will definitely be no names, addresses, or any other topics of the patient or therapist provided. This means there is no personal data being passed on to RAI. Only the combination of RAH programs that I find in a checkup or in a detailed test. And that's exactly how RAI works. So it means that you enter the email address here and if I'm in Germany or Austria, I can also enter a corresponding recommendation code, which will then be printed on the report later. But I'll come back to that later. Yes, and RAI also naturally provides the option of entering an allocation number for each day. This means that the date is always given, and then you enter the next number. For example, you would enter 03 for the third report on that day. And then you can easily find it afterwards, because, of course, the report does not include a name or address, just as we have already demonstrated and elaborated. How do you very easily bring the data from a checkup test or a detailed test into RAI? Because we don't want to start and somehow type the expression we see on the screen into RAI. That would be very time-consuming, and we don't want that. We want to find a very, very efficient solution to transfer the results from the Polar into a patient report. Yes, and that's why we came up with a very, very elegant solution here, and that is a QR code scanner that is then directly included in the app. That means we have the possibility to scan a QR code with the Polar in the app. Yes, and if we are now in the area of the checkup, you see the two options at the bottom right of the screen. On the one hand, I can tap on the checkup, and on the other hand, I can tap on the detailed test. And depending on what is selected, it would also be scanned accordingly, or then the report would be set. Let's stay with the checkup for a moment. The checkup is very special also in execution, because when I have scanned in the data via the QR code, we'll get to how that works in a moment. Then RAI identifies the three most important areas found, addresses and poses relevant questions to these areas in the overall context, similar to an anamnesis. So that means, for example, on the topic of cells and tissues, or on the topic lymphatic system, or on the topic of the heart, just as we had presented it, and here it is now that a question is asked. I then go directly in the app to yes, no, so that means the answer from the patient or mine, which is then integrated as a therapist, and I then have all the questions that are important already integrated in these three areas, like in an anamnesis form. In addition, observations of the client can also be entered. For example, I can say, yes, I'm sleeping very poorly at the moment, or I somehow have constant headaches. So something like that. It's a very open system where you can just type that in. And when I have done all that, then I have all the data for the checkup together, and then everything is compiled and presented in a report. Just briefly now about the transmission of these RAH found results via QR code. So it's like this. For RAI to use the RAH programs from the Rayoscan, and for it to be very easy for the therapist and for the user, we've decided, as already mentioned, on using this QR code. This means you then select the checkup at the bottom or the detailed test at the bottom right, and accordingly you press, in this case, now we have done it for the detailed test, the button Start QR Scanner, then scan the QR code for the detailed test. When I click on this green button, the app switches to a QR code scanner section, and I would then press the QR code button directly under Archive in Polar after the checkup test or after the detailed test. So, At this moment, the poller knows exactly from the checkup or from the detailed test which RAH programs are important. So, and here we have just the detailed analysis. We press here on the button QR code, and this screen then appears on the poller. And in this second step, the data from the RAH programs and the percentages are then integrated exactly into this QR code on the screen of the poller. And this QR code shown here then contains, for example, during the detailed test, the 40 most important found RAH programs from the ECG analysis and the intensities in percent. Exactly. So, and when I see this displayed, I can go ahead again with the RAI app, and you can see this very nicely in the image. The poller is in the background. I have the smartphone at the front, pressed the button to read QR code, and can now directly scan this QR code from the screen of the poller into RAI. It takes a fraction of a second, which allows us to, let's say, very, very user-friendly transfer the data into RAI. As mentioned, no address, no names, no personal data, and we can then directly proceed to the selection of report languages. And that is, like already mentioned, one of the very big possibilities that RAI offers. RAI is definitely supposed to break down language and understanding barriers. Yes, that is also our big goal with RAI. And due to the international nature of this system, we are present in 47 countries around the world, and the bioresonance, according to Paul Schmidt, is used there. And accordingly, many languages will, of course, also need to be handled here. And I would like to give an extreme example. As an example, we thought, imagine a therapist lives in Germany, but this is a Spanish-speaking therapist, and he is currently treating a patient from Iceland. This is certainly not a typical case, but this situation can and will increasingly occur in the future as the world becomes more internationalized. It can also be the case that in the UK, a therapist treats a Polish-speaking patient, for example, or conversely, in Spain, a German-speaking patient is treated. And in this respect, we can now beautifully about RAI not only generate a report for the therapist, but even produce the report for the patient in their native language. And this is exactly what you simply said here. This goes up to Japanese, up to Mandarin, or Hebrew, or other languages that are also somewhat harder to manage. In addition, Icelandic is of course also somewhat harder to manage because it is a very rare language, but it is still integrated into RAI. So, and then you select these two languages, then press Start, yes. And RAI then begins in the background with the evaluation and combination of all these RAH programs and creates an approximately 15-page report in the chosen languages. So that means it can also be, if I now have the normal case, for example in Hong Kong, and have a patient there who wants to read the language or the report in traditional, for example, then you can immediately set this and the report will come out just the same. It works the same way with all other languages, as already mentioned. And this report generation takes about, well, 2 minutes, I'd say. And then I have the one, or if I've selected it, both reports then on the email address you provided to the system at the beginning. And when you take a look at the report, it's already presented very clearly, and it all starts with explaining the connections of these RAH programs, not from a medical perspective, but it's an energetic analysis. That means we always refer to the energetics because that's what's important about the bioresonance, according to Paul Schmidt, and we then also build this report on it. But it's not just the connections that are presented, because we also don't want to overwhelm the patient, or rather the client, but we also want to explain the connections here in deliberately simple language and make it understandable to the patient, the client. So this means we also want to break down the barriers in understanding. And it's like this. Even at trade fairs and in the many conversations we have had about RAI, it was astonishing how many therapists repeatedly said how much time they spent interpreting these results. And when they saw that we could create this report within 2 minutes, they were absolutely thrilled, because even, let's say, the really experienced users still need time to generate this report. And I'd say the newcomers, those who are now starting with the system, are getting a very simple system with RAI to pass on such reports to the client, and also to learn a bit about the connections and the continuously created reports from an energetic perspective, how they are presented and how best to present them to the client. And this is, as I said, a very great support both for the experienced therapist and for the new therapist who has just joined. And what always emerged in the conversations with the therapists is that everyone truly understands that a cause-oriented treatment approach is, of course, absolutely important. And we all know that reducing the burdens that affect the patient's or client's body makes any therapy much faster and more effective, and of course also much more sustainable. We all know that. Nevertheless, there is a hurdle, which is most therapists are reluctant to recommend this approach because they feel like somehow they are not acting as therapists, but as salespeople. This is naturally a difficult situation because on one side, you know how helpful it is when you also immediately recommend a product in the case of a corresponding burden, which helps to ultimately make the therapy faster and more effective. Therefore, I would say that RAI will naturally become a game changer because it provides precise details of the connections and discovered RAH programs in the report and focuses on a cause-oriented treatment approach, converting the discovered RAH programs into recommendations. This means that, for example, if we find a lot of pollutants here in the report, then it is clear that a product like the Rayopure is totally suitable because it is a product that is exactly designed for this area of application, also from an energetic point of view. The same applies to minerals, topics of vitamins and trace elements, and so on. But of course, the same also applies to the topic of, for example, electrosmog or geopathy. And if you see in the report, a strong exposure, for example, to 5G or in the area of electric and magnetic alternating fields, or specifically even in the area of smartphones or other pulse-modulated stressors, RAI picks up on that and then even recommends the appropriate product to further support the therapy and maintain the cause-oriented approach here. And the reports will then state exactly why one thing or another is recommended. And in addition, at the end, either in Germany or in Austria, there will even be a QR code that links to the appropriate shop, or alternatively, a link, depending a bit on the country where the therapist is located. The patient will then be given the opportunity directly to order a product there as well, or rather therapists often offer this as well. But if someone doesn't want to do that, they can recommend the cause-oriented treatment approach through that. But by the way, that's actually not the only thing, because the report, yes, already starts with that. When I take a look at it here, it's like a printed report which then nicely presents these results on 15 pages or so. And the first sentence, which is right here at the top, is something that will probably make many therapists very happy. Because RAI operates based on the percentages and the combinatorics of these RAH programs, a corresponding recommendation that tells how many therapy sessions will likely be necessary due to the burdens, these energetic burdens found in the client. And it then recommends, for example, at this point, that here is an English report stating energetic burden heavy. Based on the results, we recommended at least 10 treatments. And that is exactly what RAI also stands for. That means the patient reads the recommendation, sees here his results, and sees the recommendation for the therapy. And we hope that with this, we can get more clients into this treatment and help them gently, because we know one thing. When we have clients in therapy, they always benefit either through regulation or through the elimination of certain influences from the environment. Anyway, that is our stated goal, to involve the clients more and to make it easier for them to decide on their own to carry out this therapy with the therapists, and also to bring out the cause-oriented approach more and to create an understanding for it. Yes, and that's RAI's purpose, and we have introduced RAI in the initial test practices, and there the direct opinion was, it's a game changer. And we then had, I just want to talk about the beginnings of RAI. We then briefly turned RAI off again because we wanted to add some specific functions. And after the shutdown, some of these test practices were already directly on the phone saying, hey, I can't reach RAI right now, what's going on there? So they had already fully embraced it, and it had already become everyday life for them to work with this system. That's how fast development can sometimes go. Now, let's get to how we can use RAI in a practical way on our smartphones. That means I would like to introduce you to the download, the trial phase, and also the costs associated with using RAI in this slide. First, we have to get the app onto our smartphone, and that depends on the phone as to which store we download RAI from. That would be the Google Play Store for an Android phone, and for an Apple phone, it would be the Apple Store. There you can download the corresponding RAI apps, and downloading the app itself onto your smartphone is free of charge at first. Yes, that means there are no costs involved. Then, when you start the app, you will be prompted directly to enter an email address. Please enter the email address there to which the reports should be sent later, because everything will refer back to that. So that is an important entry to ensure that this email address is correct. Then you will receive a so-called one-time password, an OTP code, sent to your email address for verification purposes. You will get this in your email, and you simply type the password from that email into RAI. With that, you have identified yourself as a user, and from this moment on, the 7-day trial period begins, during which you can get to know RAI with no obligation. This means you can run plenty of test reports, whether they are checkup test reports or reports for detailed tests. This is completely non-binding for you for 7 days, and you can really get to know the world of RAI without it costing you a single euro. Thus, test reports themselves all have a watermark which shows once again that we are in a test phase. So, and after 7 days, there are then 2 possibilities. That means, for one, the clearly recommended option, the monthly fee for RAI in its entirety of 89 euros. That is very, very easy to do directly from the app. And you can then generate up to 350 reports per month, regardless of whether they are checkups or detailed tests. And the other option is if you say, I want to start carefully for now, we also want to make an offer for these users, and that is what you could call pay-per-go. That means you pay into a wallet, so just a smaller amount once, for example 30 euros, and can then selectively say, I will do a detailed report for 5 euros or a checkup report for 3 euros. Every time you have done something like that, you will receive another email showing what your current account balance is. So the clear recommendation is, of course, and that is by far the simplest option, to pay the one-time fee of 89 euros for the month, and that then renews automatically just as you would like. And for that, you would have 350 reports free per month. Yes, we are truly proud of this development because, in the end, we are the first bioresonance users ever that via an AI can represent the interpretation of determined energetic connections and sets it up for the therapist or the client. And with that, the circle really closes for us as well. That means with a Polar 4.025, to perform automatic ECG-based energetic analysis, to go into the details via a checkup, and then with RAI to get an accurate representation of the connections, which in turn helps the patient to get into therapy or to clearly show them how useful home therapy can be and how important the integration of the cause-oriented treatment concept into the entire therapy concept really is. And that is exactly what we are closing now with RAI, and that is simply fantastic. We are hugely excited that we have now been able to close this circle, so to speak. And with that, a big thank you for watching, and of course, much success with RAI, the intelligent HR interpretation software.